I sipped my drink and gazed at the beautiful Texas sunset. Man, I'm going to miss this. I won't miss the summer heat. But there's something about standing in your backyard wearing only shorts and a t-shirt in November that I could have gotten used to. Oh, and the smell of Texas barbecue. Darn, my mouth is already watering. I turned and glanced back at the family cookout that was happening behind me. The gathering was in my honor, celebrating my recent promotion as shop foreman. It was labeled an adult party, and the half-dozen company employees and their spouses were there without any children. I was grateful for that because I had every intention of turning this into my farewell party. When I had the chance, I went out to my truck. I picked up what I figured I'd need for a visual aid. I suspected they'd ask me to give some kind of speech, and I wanted to make it memorable. I stuck my Glock 9mm into the back of my jeans and made sure it wasn't noticeable under my dinner jacket. Making my way back through the guests, I saw my boss coming towards me. Tommy Peterson was a big, jolly guy with a smile that could light up half of Dallas. Even in his 50s, the man had a presence about him that both demanded respect and put you at ease. Beside him walked Martha, his wife, my problem. All right, maybe she isn't the problem. Maybe she's just the person who keeps opening the darn door and letting the real problem in. It doesn't really matter. Either way, it gets taken care of today. Martha Peterson was more than a little on the heavy side, but was still decent looking, even in her 50s. She had that kind of personality that drew people to her and made her mama or grandma to just about everyone. Problem was she believed the old wives' tale mama knows best. Since I moved here 11 months ago, she had made it her mission in life to set me up with the perfect woman. It didn't matter what I did or what I said. She couldn't get it through her thick head I just wasn't interested in dating. I'm still trying to get over my first marriage. Maybe if I would have yelled or thrown some kind of fit, she would have gotten the hint. But that just isn't me. I tend to be quiet, polite, and private. I guess if I'd been more of a jerk. Well, that's going to change. There they sat, Martha and several of the other wives, all just beaming like cats that had caught a mouse. They'd found their perfect girl for me, and there she was sitting with them. She was beautiful, barely 5 feet, but with a good figure, long blonde hair, and a very pretty face. Of course, she always looked great because she worked in a beauty salon. I had to give them credit. I thought she was the perfect girl for me too, till about 2 years ago. Unfortunately, the perfect girl they'd been pushing on me the past couple months was my ex-wife, Teresa. The fact they knew that is what really bothered me. I hadn't told them the real story behind my divorce because it wasn't any of their business. I'd told them I didn't want to date her, or talk to her, or even be in the same state as her. Now, there she sat, surrounded by a bunch of women who were extremely pleased with themselves at finally getting my ex-wife and me face to face. Teresa probably hadn't told them much about how our marriage ended because she tended to leave out little things when she didn't want to face something. She had a way about her that charmed almost everyone she met. She'd told them she'd made a mistake and that I refused to talk to her and forgive her. She'd played the broken and sorry wife role perfectly. That and her I pray for the chance to show Doug how much I really love him routine had Martha and her friends eating out of her hand. Tommy stood up, addressed the group, and finally introduced me. Showtime. I'd like to thank Y all for coming out tonight. I know this was supposed to be a celebration, and I guess it is in a way. Tommy offered me the job as shop foreman, and I want to thank him for that. But sir, I'm going to have to turn it down because as of today, I quit. Sorry to spring this on you, and I'll understand if you don't want to give me a good reference, but I'm going to be gone tomorrow no matter what happens. I watched the startled faces as Tommy opened his mouth to say something. Doug, this is a party in my home, he said sternly. No disrespect to you, sir. You've been more than fair with me and I owe you an explanation, but there are others here, I said coldly, that I sure as heck don't owe anything. Doug, Martha said. Martha, I think you and the rest of your little group have done more than enough to me. I'd made it very clear I didn't want to date anyone, and I sure as heck made it clear I didn't want to be anywhere near my ex-wife. Apparently what I want isn't important, so I'm either going to speak now or I leave for good. Your choice. Either one sounds pretty good to me right now. The group was silent except for the sound of Teresa crying. All right, then I'll tell you a little story. Teresa looked up at me and slowly shook her head, her eyes begging me to not go on. You see, about 2 years ago, I left my little hometown in Georgia for the first time in my life. I left behind a destroyed marriage and a family who'd turned their backs on me. I came here 11 months ago, trying to start a new life, but it seems I can't get away from my past. It just keeps finding me, with the help of others. I glared at Martha until she looked away. I married my high school sweetheart 5 years ago. She was everything I ever wanted or dreamed of. We got married after she graduated, and for 3 years I thought we had the perfect marriage. She worked in a beauty salon and I worked in one of my family's garages. My dad owned several garages across northern Georgia, so that's where I learned to be a mechanic. But just like the Garden of Eden had a serpent, so did my marriage. Unfortunately, my serpent turned out to be my younger brother, Billy. Billy is 3 years younger than me, but he's always been the center of attention in my family. He's supposedly a recovering drug addict and has been since he was 15 and dropped out of school. All my life, my parents have looked out for him, sacrificed themselves and me, for whatever was best for Billy. I heard, "Doug, we have to help him. He's sick more times than I can count." So 3 years ago, when I heard he'd been evicted from his latest place, I wasn't surprised. My family, including my wife, wanted him to stay with us until he could get admitted into another rehab. My response wasn't no, but heck no. Both my wife and my parents were shocked and appalled I could be so cold and turn my back on my brother. In my mind, I didn't turn my back on him, I just wasn't enabling him. Over the next few weeks, they made my life a living heck, pressuring me until I agreed to let Billy come and stay. And my reward for trying to be a good big brother? I glared at my ex-wife, trying to calm myself. Imagine my surprise, a few months later, when the doctor told us there was something wrong with the baby. That the baby had a small heart defect that was common with women who used cocaine. My wife, of course, denied ever using drugs. Then the doctor said something that turned my world into a nightmare. My wife, the one who I trusted more than anyone in this world, told me I was the child's father. But things weren't adding up right. When the baby was born, they did the surgery. It was considered a total success. But I'm not a complete fool, so I had a DNA test run. When the results came back, it was final. I was an uncle. I lost it. I threw all of my cheating wife's things out of the house, grabbed my Glock, and went looking for that terrible person I once called a brother. I looked everywhere but couldn't find him. My parents had stashed him in some out-of-state rehab. So how did they know? Well, there's another little blow. Seems my brother waited a whole week before he told them about sharing his older brother's reason to live. Then the 4 of them sat on their behinds, hoping I would never find out their little secret. I filed for divorce the next day. As soon as my unfaithful wife got served, the non-stop load of bull started from her and my parents. I wouldn't talk to the cheating jerk for weeks. I couldn't stand to look at her or even hear her voice. I was in shock. All my dreams were shattered. I'd been taken advantage of and lied to by the ones who claimed they loved me. After a week of non-stop crap from my parents, I agreed to talk to her. I heard all her excuses. He was depressed and said he had nothing to live for. She felt sorry for him. She was only trying to comfort him, and it went too far. The marijuana he was smoking clouded her mind. It was only that one night. Seems their first attempt was so bad he started talking suicide. The second time, she restored his will to live. My ex-wife, trying to earn sainthood one jerk at a time, makes one wonder if she's been visiting the homeless shelters and spreading her joy. Both Teresa and my parents were on me like flies on poop, but they weren't alone. They recruited others to talk to me. My favorite was when the pastor of the church my family has attended for generations paid me a visit. My family was big in giving to the church and had funded a bunch of their building projects. He went on and on about forgiveness. After a bit, I got tired of it and agreed to forgive, but with 2 conditions. The first was that he would preach a sermon Sunday on coveting your brother's wife. The second was that the following Sunday I would get to stand before the entire congregation and give my testimony before I publicly forgave them. I smiled as I remembered his reaction. I never heard from him again. Of course, my parents just kept going, I snarled. I heard all their expected nonsense. I needed to be a bigger person than this. Teresa had made a mistake, but her heart was good. My wife and baby needed me, and a real man wouldn't abandon them. They raised me better than this. They went on and on. My dad finally told me how disappointed he was in me for not forgiving Teresa and Billy. I told them both how disappointed I was in them as parents. After that, I gave them both barrels and told exactly what I thought of them. It was very ugly. Finally, when they asked me if I'd read my brother's apology letter and that I shouldn't blame Billy because he was sick, I lost it again. I told them I treated his letter with disrespect. I also told them to never mention my brother's name to me ever again. They didn't believe me. So I decided to convince them. I stared at my audience, making sure I had their complete attention. Reaching behind me, I pulled out my weapon. There were several gasps and more than a few shocked words. I thanked God I was at Tommy and Martha's house. Usually pulling a weapon in Texas would get you in trouble. But I knew Martha had banned any weapons from being brought into her home, so I would be the only one carrying. The firearms my coworkers usually carried would have been left in their trucks or other vehicles. I lowered my voice to sound intense and continued. I see you had the same reaction as my parents. I remember the harsh words I spoke to them. You mentioned that terrible person's name to me one more time, and I will hunt them down and confront them. I swear to God, you will be mourning the loss of your favorite son within the week. I paused to watch the shock on several people's faces. I had definitely made my point. Apparently, my parents believed me since they haven't spoken to me since that day. Too bad I can't say the same for my ex-wife. I figured I might actually harm someone if I stayed there any longer, so I moved across the state line to Alabama to wait out my divorce. I left Teresa and the child everything except a few dollars I needed to start over again. I guess I should be grateful it took her 6 months to find me. I'd heard she had some kind of breakdown and had to be hospitalized. Seemed she tried to harm herself. She failed. It was like her trying to stay loyal to her husband, close but no cigar. I stared at Teresa as she buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved as she sobbed. I'd like to tell you I felt sorry for her, but I didn't. She's the one who tore my heart apart and left me in pain. All that remains is the ache from my past and a fury I have to fight to control every day. In the past 2 years, I found it difficult to move on. The fact that Teresa keeps stalking me doesn't help. She always used to say we were meant to be together forever. I thought it was a bit silly, like she read it somewhere and just liked the idea. But now, I have my doubts. I've never felt so alone, like a part of me is missing. I find myself looking next to me, wanting to ask for her opinion. At times, I've even reached out for her hand, but it's never there. I can feel my heart growing colder and the anger growing each time it happens. Before all of this, she'd always been by my side. I remember my graduation. My dad couldn't come because Billy had gotten in trouble again. Dad had gone down to the police station to pick him up and speak with an official. My mom was so worried, she was a mess, so I told her to go and join Dad. So my graduation party included my friends and some family members, but none of my immediate family. I tried to hide my disappointment, but Teresa saw through it right away. I woke up in the middle of the night after my party, lying in my bed with her beside me. I noticed my parents standing in my doorway, staring at us. Slowly, I got up, put on my boxers, and walked over to my bedroom door. My dad wanted to say something about Teresa being there, but he thought better of it. My mom had tears in her eyes. They both whispered their apologies to me for missing my party. I lied and told them it wasn't a big deal. I remember telling them I'd be moving out soon and I'd be moving in with my cousin until Teresa and I could get married. Then I shut the door in their faces. My attention was drawn back to my audience when a couple started to stand up. I cleared my throat and shook my head. They quickly sat back down. Carefully, I put my weapon down beside me and you could hear the sighs of relief. I looked at them and continued my story. When she finally found me, she moved into the same trailer park I was living in. After I got a court order to keep her away and still filed about a dozen more complaints, I knew I needed to move again. The divorce had finally come through, so I packed up and moved here to Texas. She didn't mention the little fact of a restraining order to you when she gave you her sad story about our marriage, did she, Martha? Martha was now starting to cry as she shook her head. Didn't think so. She's pretty good at leaving out important details. When I got to Texas, I was lucky to find someone like Tommy who helped me start over again. He gave me the chance to prove myself and didn't ask too many questions about my past. I'd made it clear I didn't want to talk about my past, and after making sure I wasn't running from the law, he was fine with that. Again, too bad his wife wouldn't listen. I hadn't told anyone where I was moving, not even the couple of friends I still had in Georgia. So imagine my surprise when 3 months ago my ex-wife moved into town. An even bigger surprise was when my boss's wife decided to try to get me and my cheating ex-wife back together again. Martha started to speak, but I interrupted her. You had your chance, but you sure as heck never listened. Now it's my turn, I spewed with enough anger to shut her up. I've made it clear many times over the last year I didn't want to date and didn't want to discuss or have to explain my past. I sure as heck didn't want to get back with my wife. but apparently what I want doesn't matter at all. Martha sobbed. Doug, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I cut her off right there. Didn't know. I spat. Since when do you have to know before you'll respect someone else's privacy? Who do you think you are that someone has to explain everything to you before you'll give him the basic courtesy of staying out of his life? I could tell my words had hit their mark. It was time to wrap up this sad little show. So Martha, I want to thank you and these other nosy individuals for making my last 2 months miserable. I would wish you all well, but that would be a lie. Honestly, I hope you all turn on each other and make each other's lives miserable. I looked down and saw Teresa's tear-streaked face. Please, baby, please, she begged. Please give me another chance. I told you to stay away from me, Teresa. Go home to your child. I can't unless I bring his daddy back with me. If you want to find the kid's father, go look in some rehab or in some difficult situation. If you meant me, then it's never going to happen. If you haven't been following our sad story. I sure as heck am not the kid's father. I picked up my weapon, put it back in my belt, and turned to walk through the crowd. They moved to let me through. I heard several apologies, and a few even looked me in the eye. As I reached the driveway, I heard Teresa scream behind me. No, Doug, wait, please don't go. I can't live without you, Doug. She shrieked as she fell to the ground weeping. You have to come home, you just have to. I turned around and looked at her. Listen, I don't care if you hurt yourself or not, just stay away from me. I saw everyone staring at me. Seems I still can't get anyone to listen, I growled and walked to my truck. Teresa, the doctors tell me recording my thoughts is good therapy, and this will help me discover myself. Personally, I think they're mistaken. They don't seem to understand that I've lost my Doug. He's my rock, my soulmate, my best friend, and until recently, my husband. I lost him because of one foolish mistake. A mistake he can't forgive me for. To understand us, you need to know our past. Doug and I started dating in high school. He was a sophomore and I was just a freshman. I knew I loved him from the moment we first hugged. We went all through high school together and I knew we would end up getting married. 3 months after I graduated, we had our wedding. I'm sure my parents were thrilled. First, they were glad I was out of their house, and second, because we didn't have to get married. As good little Southern Baptists, I think they were afraid I was going to get pregnant. My parents and I were always arguing. They loved Doug but didn't like my lifestyle. The partying and drinking was too much for them. Of course, they knew I'd never do that with anyone but Doug. He was all I'd ever wanted. He's always been who I thought was my soulmate. Even when I messed up, it had nothing to do with my love for him, although he doesn't see it that way. All he sees is the betrayal. He doesn't understand that when I see how much he's hurt, I feel devastated too. Doug has always been my rock. Whenever I would lose control, he was always there, until now. Most people think he's shy and quiet, but I know better. What he really is a volcano. He's always calm on the outside, but inside it can just build and build until he explodes. I've seen it happen several times, but rarely ever in public. One time it happened in front of a bunch of our classmates. We'd gone to a party and had been hanging out when this jerk, Jerry Whitmore, touched me inappropriately. I turned around and slapped him. Then he tried to touch me again. He must have had a death wish to do that in front of Doug. Even though Doug isn't the biggest guy, he's strong and in really good shape. Jerry didn't even get a punch in before Doug had him on the ground, sitting on him and punching him. It took 3 guys to pull Doug off him, and when they did, there was blood everywhere. Doug really hurt him, and there was talk of charging Doug. But then I threatened to report Jerry for harassment and everything was dropped. Needless to say, I never had a problem with any other guy after that. Like I said earlier, Doug and I got married right after I graduated. It was the happiest time that I can remember. He was already working as a mechanic in one of his father's garages, and I went to beauty school. Soon, we had enough money saved to buy our first house. It wasn't much, just a little 2-bedroom house. But it was ours. The first 2 years were tough since we didn't have much money, but we had each other and it was more than enough. I was so happy it seemed I was living in some fairy tale. Doug and I didn't have a perfect marriage, but it sure seemed that way sometimes. We'd argue, but then I'd get upset or tearful, and he would give in most of the time. I didn't do that very often. I didn't want to take advantage of my Doug. Our love was like a protective wall around us, keeping us safe from the outside world. I guess that's why I never saw the danger until it was too late. When Billy was evicted from his trailer, our problem started. He had no place to stay since, at the time, he was arguing with his and Doug's parents. Even though they didn't want him staying with them again so soon after the last time, they didn't want him on the street either. They asked us if he could stay with us for a few weeks until they could get him into another rehab center. I said okay, but Doug said no. I knew Doug had lots of issues with his family, most of them he had a right to be angry about. Doug's parents, Tom and Paula, are pretty decent people. They were just unlucky enough to have a son that was a mess. That mess tore their family apart and then affected ours as well. Billy was always the loud one, the one who'd do almost anything on a dare. While Doug, on the other hand, was that quiet force always standing in the background, but you always knew was there. Together they were a team. That lasted until Doug went to high school. In high school, Doug started hanging around his friends and football teammates more. Billy reacted by being even more an attention hound. Soon, it was obvious Billy was going to try to be a bad boy or some kind of rebel. It's not surprising that Billy started hanging around the troublemakers. Doug and I were dating by then, and I knew it tore Doug up watching Billy fall into that bad crowd. Billy was a full-fledged addict by the time he was a freshman. He'd already caused a lot of problems within the family. He dropped out the same year Doug graduated. Doug's parents tried everything but didn't know what to do with Billy. They tried talking, bribing, threatening, and finally they tried some tough love. Billy simply used it as an excuse to drop out of school. After that, Tom and Paula ended up giving in to him on just about everything. While I understood their problem, it then became all about Billy. They did everything for him and basically left Doug to fend for himself most of the time. I know that really hurt Doug. Billy was just hell-bent on ruining his life. It was too bad because he could have been something special. My Doug is a good-looking guy, but everyone agrees Billy would have been even better looking when he grew up. Unfortunately, with the drug addiction, no one will ever know. Doug tried several times to reach out to Billy. Billy's response was to steal from his brother and his parents, then buy more drugs. When Billy turned 18, Doug stopped trying. We'd been married about 2.5 years when Billy got evicted. I'll admit Tom, Paula, and I were pretty persistent in trying to get Doug to change his mind. I think Tom and Paula felt they were out of options, and I think they needed to ease their guilt. They didn't want Billy to come back to live with them again. They had just thrown him out several months earlier after he'd taken a lot of money from them. I wanted Doug to change his mind because you can't just turn your back on family. Also, it was getting close to Christmas, and it would have been a terrible holiday with Billy living on the street. It was just a few days after Christmas when I let my fairy tale marriage come crashing down. Doug had called and told me he was trying to fix the car for a middle-aged, single mother of 3 there in town. It was her only car, so he and one of the other guys were going to work through the night to fix it for her. Gosh, I love him. I got home late from the beauty salon that night. When I walked into the house, I almost gagged. The smell from Billy's cigarette was overpowering. I walked over and knocked on the bedroom door, but he didn't answer me. Upset, I opened up some windows and then went to take a shower. After my shower, I got ready for bed. The smell of smoke still lingered, but I needed to close the windows because it was cold outside. After closing the windows, I went and knocked on Billy's door again. This time he answered. The way he looked scared me. His eyes were bloodshot, and I couldn't tell if it was from the smoke or if he'd been crying. He had such a look of despair and sadness I really started worrying about him. He turned around, walked back over by the bed, and sat on the floor next to his bong. I stepped in and immediately felt a wave from the smoke. I had smoked pot occasionally, so I was familiar with its effects. I went and got a fan and brought it back into the room. I opened a window and set the fan to start blowing the smoke out. Billy just sat there muttering. When I was done, I sat down next to him. Even though that night is fuzzy, I'm sure I remember the way things happened. I remember I started talking to him. Gosh, Billy, I said, if Doug smells this when he gets home, he'll be really upset with you. Maybe that would be for the best. He muttered. When I looked at him, I saw such sadness. It was like he had given up. Gosh, it doesn't matter anyway, he sighed, while tilting his head back and looking at the ceiling. I'm falling apart anyway. I was shocked. It took me a few seconds to respond. Oh no, Billy, do you have a serious illness? He scoffed and shook his head. Nah, I hate needles. But it's the other way of getting sick that's proof I'm falling apart. He looked at me and must have seen my confusion. With a deep, sad sigh, he answered my unspoken question. Dang it, he started. Even with some of the sketchy people I hang around, I couldn't get sick that way, even if I tried. He sat there watching me as it finally dawned on me what he meant. When it did, I couldn't believe it. I mean, gosh, he had just turned 19. Did you see a doctor? Yeah, he nodded. He said it was the drugs. Darn it, I tested negative for STDs and that serious illness, but it doesn't make a whole lot of difference now, does it? I can't usually perform, and when I do, I can't stay solid for very long. I can barely scrape enough money together to feed my habit, so buying some little blue pills isn't likely. Darn it, if I can't be much of a man, I might as well end it. So getting thrown out by my lucky big brother really doesn't mean anything. We sat quietly for a few minutes. I'm ashamed that I began to think of ways to help, and most of them I knew Doug wouldn't approve of. Doug's not really lucky, he just works hard, I said. That isn't what I was talking about, he mumbled. Billy looked at me with tears in his eyes. Then what? I asked softly. I was talking about you, he whispered. I know, I blushed. I turned my head so he couldn't see it. Doug's always been lucky because of you. You give him the strength to do what he needs to do. If it wasn't for you, he'd be just as big of a mess as I am. So yeah, he's lucky. If I had found someone like you, things would have been different. He buried his head in his hands and sighed. I know he was boosting my confidence. At least I do now. Then, well, things are fuzzy. I think it was the smoke, since it was still pretty heavy in the room. If I could go back, then I would have left right then. But I didn't. What I did was open the door to the end of my marriage. I looked over at him and I saw a broken kid, someone who didn't have a reason to live. My heart broke as I saw his pain. I reached over and put my arms around him and hugged him. Billy, I whispered. You shouldn't, please, Teresa, he begged softly. I've never hugged a nice woman before. Please. I know I should have stopped it right there, but I froze. Billy, I whispered. Please, Teresa, I need a reason to live. Was that a line? Of course it was. But I actually believed he was in despair. Whether I was out of it or just stunned by the moment, I didn't get up, I didn't scream, I didn't kick, or do the things I should have if I wanted to fight for my marriage. Instead, I just sat there confused, torn on what I should do. He sat back and I remember that I'd never seen a face before with so much torment. He actually began to cry. It was then I made my decision. I remember thinking that the damage had already been done. I had allowed Billy to cross a line that Doug would never forgive. I hadn't stopped him from having relations with me either. Come here, I said softly. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you. I quickly grabbed my clothes and started for the bedroom door. Billy called out to me. Teresa, I turned and stared at him as the tears began to fill my eyes. Never again, Billy, I said softly. This will never happen again, and Doug can't ever know. You understand me? He can't know. Ever. Billy nodded and lay back on the bed. He covered his face with his arms, and I think I heard him begin to cry. I went and took another shower. I hadn't intended to cheat on Doug, but that's the way he'd see it. The fact it was with his brother would devastate him. I cried myself to sleep that night. I knew I'd changed us forever. The next morning, Doug was furious. The smell of marijuana was still noticeable. He almost kicked Billy out right then and there. Why he didn't, I'm not really sure. I was a mess, still trying to get my emotions under control so Doug wouldn't sense anything was wrong. When he asked, I told him I'd had a nightmare that he'd left me. My Doug was mine and I was his again. I would never again be so foolish. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Billy watching me, but he never tried to talk to me alone. He moved out 3 weeks later. 2 weeks after he'd moved out, I discovered I was pregnant. Doug and I were thrilled. I honestly never believed the child wasn't Doug's. Not until Billy asked me if he might be the father did I start getting concerned. I learned, much to my anger and embarrassment, that Billy had already confessed to Tom and Paula what had happened. They weren't happy, but they didn't abandon me either. After talking with them, we decided to keep our secret and pray Doug would never find out. I was sick. I'd never kept anything from Doug before, but I knew this would devastate him. Every night I prayed the child was his, and he'd never find out. The day that doctor said there was a problem with the baby, I knew my prayers weren't answered. He said it could be fixed with surgery. But depending on how severe it was, they might have to do surgery right after it was born. When he said that kind of birth defect had been linked to cocaine abuse, my heart stopped beating. He asked me if I did drugs, and I told him absolutely not. Then he asked Doug the same thing and said they had studies showing if the father was a drug user, it could cause defects too. I almost died right there. Doug started to lose control until the doctor told him that when it came to birth defects, they didn't know anything for sure. but I knew right then the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few months, I tried to assure Doug that it was his without letting him know there was a possibility it wasn't. He never came right out and asked. I knew I was holding on to just a glimmer of hope the baby really was Doug's, but there weren't any other options. After the baby was born, all chaos broke loose. Doug got a DNA test and found out that Billy was the father. He threw my belongings out of the house that day. Not surprisingly, my parents disowned me, and I ended up moving in with Doug's parents. Doug wouldn't even talk to me for 2 weeks. He finally agreed to meet with me after his parents had been after him daily for almost a week. I know our talk was one-sided, but I had to get my husband to listen to me. He had to see how sorry I was and how much I needed him. I pleaded and begged, pouted and shouted, screamed and cried. I would have done anything if I thought it would make Doug listen and understand. He really is my life, my love, my soulmate. I tried everything I could think of, but my husband just wasn't listening. I begged him to forgive me and told him that it was just a terrible mistake. Over the next week, his parents and I tried everything to get him to sit down and talk with us, to try to find a way to work through this. Billy even wrote him a letter trying to explain and apologize. I'm not blind. I could see how us constantly pestering him was affecting my husband. I could see the anger and frustration building in Doug. All someone has to do is watch his eyes, they're his tell. The more they squint, the closer he is to exploding. But I didn't have any other choice, he just wouldn't listen. I called him 15 times a day and went to his workplace a couple of times each day. Was I stalking Doug? I guess it could have seemed that way. But I've never backed away from a fight if it is about something important, and there's nothing more important than my Doug. When he finally did talk to me, I almost wished he hadn't. He ended up pulling off my wedding ring while I sat there, terrified by his words. Up until then, I'd seen my husband's rage but was never threatened by it. Now I was its target, and it scared me so much. About that time, Tom and Paula told me it's best to leave things be and stopped helping me. Doug had said some things to them that shook them up pretty badly. Like I said, his rage can be scary at times. I lost it when he moved to Alabama. For the first time, I considered my life without my Doug. It was dark and cold, and there was no hope or joy in it. The man I loved hated me. That night, I mixed a bottle of sleeping pills with a bottle of fruit juice. I woke up the next day in the hospital with a splitting headache and on suicide watch. They said I'd started calling people after Doug wouldn't take any more of my calls. They obviously found me in time and flushed out my system. After that, Doug Jr., that's the baby's name, went to live with Tom and Paula. I'm not allowed to be around him much. I'd like to say that bothers me, but it doesn't. The baby is a mistake, just a painful reminder that I don't have my husband. It took a little while, but I was able to track Doug down in Alabama after I got out of the hospital. I moved into the small trailer park where he was living. Needless to say, he wasn't thrilled to see me. I got a job at a local beauty parlor and settled into my routine. Work ... call Doug ... work ... visit Doug ... dog. Soon I was visited by the Bama cops. I had to change my routine a bit when Doug filed a restraining order on me. But I didn't stop trying to talk to him. I couldn't, because if I had, I would have lost him completely. It was about this time that Doug got his divorce. I guess the judge heard the baby was his brother's and figured we wouldn't be able to work it out. He just didn't know us very well. A couple of months after the divorce, Doug moved again. It took me 8 months to find him. He'd moved to Texas. This time, when I moved to be near him, I didn't pressure him like I had in the past. I met some of the ladies whose husbands and boyfriends worked with him. I told them some of the highlights of our relationship, mainly focusing on my desire to get back together with him. I never lied to them. I just didn't tell them everything. I'd gotten another job in a salon, so I could take it slower this time. If you're wondering about how I can get a job so quick, the answer is simple. I work fairly cheap, and I do very good work. It took a little while, but Martha could see how much I loved him and how sorry I was I'd ruined it for us. I think she also saw how unhappy Doug was. So even though he said he wasn't interested in talking to me, we all knew it was just a matter of time before he would. That time finally came at his party. What Martha and I had planned backfired in the worst way possible. What started as a promising night quickly turned bad. Doug told everyone his version of our story. It was condensed and very harsh. I didn't dare interrupt him. I could see his eyes squinting. After he was done, I begged him to come home with me, and he told me to go hurt myself. I knew then I'd lost him for good. After the party, I fell apart. Martha got me to a hospital, and several days later I found myself here, in an Atlanta hospital under another suicide watch. You may be wondering about the baby. Well, I'm told it's doing great. I haven't been around him since right before my first breakdown. Tom and Paula are taking care of the baby right now. They'll probably end up adopting him because, let's face it, I'm a terrible mother. What else would you call a woman who can't stand to look at her own child? I know that sounds horrible, but every time I see him, I remember my mistake and all it cost me. It's not the baby's fault, I know, but that doesn't change anything. Does that make me a terrible person? Heck yes, in my eyes it does. I guess the doctors were right. This did help me discover who I am. Of course, who I found out I am makes me sick. I'm an awful wife and mother who lost her only reason to live. I'll probably have to hide this little recording, or they'll never let me out of here. They say they want you to be honest, but when you are, it scares them. I've no doubt someday I'll figure out a way to deal with this. I pray it's soon. Epilogue. Doug. I stood on the California beach, looking out over the Pacific. The nightmare I'd lived over the past few years was finally over. The ending had actually started several weeks after the party. I'd received a message from my cousin in Georgia that Teresa had taken her own life. I was in shock. It felt like waiting for a tragic event to happen, hoping against hope that somehow things would work out, but knowing they couldn't. I still cared for her deeply, but I couldn't have ever gone back to her. Then I knew what I had to do. I wrote 2 heartfelt letters, enclosed them with a small black jewelry box, and sent it via certified mail to my parents. The first letter was addressed to my parents, informing them that since Teresa had chosen to end her life, it was now my responsibility as her uncle to take care of my nephew's future. I assured them that I knew they would provide for him financially after Billy and I were gone. I ended the letter by wishing them better luck raising my nephew than they had raising Billy and me. The little black box was intended for my brother. Inside were 4 items: the broken pieces of Teresa and my wedding rings, a single bullet, and a note that simply said escape. It took me a few weeks to track him down. Finally, I found him in a rundown house in Atlanta. He was living there with some of his other troubled friends. I remembered the fear in his eyes when I pointed my unloaded gun at him. The smell in the room was unpleasant, to say the least. Please, he pleaded. End it. Doug, I can't bear the guilt. I'm truly sorry. Some might perceive it as weakness, others as strength, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. I removed a bullet from my gun and threw it towards him. Do it yourself, you awful person. You won't ruin any more of my existence. Go ruin someone else's life. That was the last time I saw him, lying there in tears. I left Georgia that night, knowing I had severed all ties with that place. I would never return home again. That was a couple weeks ago. I received a message this morning informing me that they had found Billy's lifeless body. He had passed away due to an overdose. Clutched in his hand was a bullet. That chapter of my life had come to an end. As I gazed out at the vast ocean, I couldn't spot a single boat or ship as far as the eye could see. A feeling of solitude engulfed me, matching the void in my heart. How does one carry on without their kindred spirit? I was about to embark on that journey,